He was 16 years old, standing in a cramped New York shoe shop, hunched over a workbench that wasn't even his own. No money, no English, not really, not yet. No family name that meant anything in this country. Just a needle, a spool of thread, and hands that already knew more about leather than most men would ever learn in a lifetime. You would think a poor Jewish immigrant boy from a Ukrainian port city, stitching soles for pennies in someone else's shop, would spend his whole life exactly like that. Invisible, replaceable. One more set of hands in one more sweatshop. Well, that boy's name was Nathan Swartz, and by the time he was done, the company he built from nothing would put boots on the feet of loggers in Maine, presidents in the Oval Office, rap legends in Brooklyn, and fashion-obsessed teenagers on the streets of Milan. He'd build a brand worth billions, a boot so iconic it would end up in museums, in song lyrics, in the closets of people who never once thought about the man who made it possible. So how does a broke apprentice with a needle and thread become the founder of Timberland? To understand that, we have to go all the way back to 1902, to a city on the Black Sea that most Americans have never heard of. I want you to picture Odessa, Ukraine, at the turn of the 20th century. It's a port city, chaotic and beautiful, full of merchants and sailors, and, tragically, a rising tide of violence against its Jewish population. Nathan Swartz was born there in July of 1902 into a family that had been making shoes for 4 generations. His father made shoes, his grandfather made shoes, his great-grandfather made shoes. This wasn't a hobby, it was survival. In a world that offered Jewish families in Russia almost no stability, almost no legal protection, and almost no path upward, a trade you could carry in your hands was one of the only things nobody could take from you. And they tried to take everything else. In 1905, when Nathan was just a toddler, Odessa erupted in one of the most brutal pogroms in the city's history. Homes burned, families fled. The Jewish community lived under the constant threat that the ground beneath them could shift into violence at any moment. This was the world Nathan Swartz was born into. Poverty layered on top of persecution, with a pair of cobbler's hands as the only inheritance his family could reliably pass down. So like millions of others, the Swartz family made the impossible decision to leave everything behind. Sometime before the outbreak of the First World War, they crossed an ocean and landed in the United States, chasing the same promise that pulled so many immigrant families toward American shores. The promise that hard work might actually be rewarded here, instead of punished. Try to imagine that crossing for a moment. No first-class cabins, no guarantee of what waited on the other side. Just a family, packed in with thousands of other refugees fleeing the same violence, holding on to whatever they could carry, including, in the Swartz family's case, a trade passed down through 4 generations of hands. They didn't bring gold, they didn't bring land. They brought the one thing that couldn't be confiscated at a border crossing or burned in a pogrom: the knowledge of how to build something useful out of leather and thread. That inheritance would turn out to be worth more than anyone in that family could have imagined at the time. But arriving in America didn't erase the poverty. It just changed its address. The Swartz family settled into the crowded, working-class immigrant neighborhoods of New York. And like so many children of poor immigrant households at the time, young Nathan didn't get the luxury of a long childhood. At just 16 years old, around 1918, he was sent out to work as an apprentice stitcher in a small New York shoe shop. No formal schooling in the trade, no mentorship program, just an apprenticeship in the truest, harshest sense of the word. Learn by doing, learn by failing, learn by getting it right enough times that someone lets you keep your job. You have to understand what that actually meant. An apprentice stitcher in 1918 wasn't designing anything. He wasn't dreaming up a brand. He was cutting leather until his fingers bled. He was stitching shoe tops to soles for 10, 12 hours a day. He was repairing worn-out boots for other people, boots he could never have afforded himself. This was the flaw the world saw in Nathan Swartz, not a character flaw, but a circumstantial one, the kind that's almost impossible to escape. He was poor, he was foreign, he had no capital, no connections, and no path to ownership. In the shoe trade of early 20th century New York, men like Nathan Swartz weren't supposed to become owners. They were supposed to stay stitchers forever. But here's the thing about a craft passed down through 4 generations. You don't just learn the motions, you learn the why. Nathan didn't just learn how to attach a sole to an upper. He learned why one stitch pattern held under pressure and another one failed. He learned which leather cracked in the cold and which one flexed and lasted. While the other apprentices around him were simply putting in hours, Nathan Swartz was building an internal library of knowledge that nobody could see yet, but that would, decades later, turn out to be worth a fortune. Because here's what I think people miss about apprenticeships like Nathan's. There was no ladder in front of him, no clear next rung that said senior stitcher or shop supervisor or future owner. The shoe repair trade in early 20th century New York was crowded with immigrants exactly like him. Italian, Irish, Jewish, Polish, all competing for the same handful of positions, all replaceable, all essentially anonymous to the men who owned the shops. If Nathan Swartz had simply done adequate work and collected an adequate wage, nobody would have blamed him. Nobody would have even noticed. But adequate was never really the goal for a boy raised inside a 4-generation shoemaking family. His father hadn't just taught him how to fix a shoe. He taught him that a shoe that fails its owner is a kind of small personal betrayal, and that was a standard Nathan carried into every single pair he touched, whether anyone was watching or not. And for 34 years, that's exactly what he did. He didn't have some meteoric rise. He didn't get discovered. Nathan Swartz spent over 3 decades working as a shoemaker, largely in repair shops, saving whatever he could, dollar by dollar, from wages that were never generous to begin with. 34 years. Let that sink in for a second. 34 years of stitching other men's shoes, watching other men own the shops, other men take the profits, while he quietly built a skill set and a savings account that almost nobody around him would have bet on turning into anything. I think this is the part of the story people skip past too quickly, because it's not glamorous. There's no dramatic turning point in those 34 years, no single triumphant moment. Just discipline. Just a man doing the same difficult, underpaid work day after day, refusing to believe that stitcher was the only word that would ever describe him. If you told anyone in that shop in, say, 1935, that this quiet, hardworking man in his 30s would one day own a boot company that outfitted American workers, revolutionize waterproof footwear, and eventually get worn by rappers and rock stars, they would have laughed. Nathan Swartz had every reason to accept his station. He didn't. By the early 1950s, decades of saved wages had finally added up to something real, enough capital finally to make a move. And in 1952, at the age of nearly 50, an age when most men in his position were thinking about retirement, not reinvention, Nathan Swartz did something almost nobody expected. He bought a 50% stake in a small Massachusetts footwear operation called the Abington Shoe Company. This wasn't some glamorous acquisition. Abington Shoe Company was a modest outfit that made handmade safety footwear, sturdy, unglamorous, working-class boots. But for Nathan Swartz, But this was everything. This was the moment the stitcher became an owner. This was 34 years of patience, finally converting into equity, into control, into the ability to build something with his name attached to the outcome instead of someone else's. However, and there's always a however in stories like this, half ownership wasn't full ownership. Nathan Swartz still had a partner, still had to share decisions, still didn't have complete control over the direction of the company he'd sacrificed decades to help build. But he wasn't finished. By 1955, just 3 years later, Swartz had scraped together enough to buy out his partner entirely, acquiring full ownership of Abington Shoe Company for $20,000. $20,000. In today's money, that's a meaningful sum, sure, but it's not exactly the war chest of a footwear empire. It was a bet, a calculated, hard-earned, deeply personal bet by a man who'd spent his entire adult life proving that patience and craftsmanship could eventually buy you a seat at the table. And this is where the story could have ended quietly. Plenty of small American shoe manufacturers in the 1950s stayed exactly that: small, regional, forgotten within a generation. Nathan Swartz could have run Abington Shoe Company as a modest, stable business, made a comfortable living, and passed away with a nice but unremarkable legacy. But he didn't build this company alone, and he had no intention of keeping it small. He brought his 2 sons, Sidney and Herman, into the business, and together, this father and son's operation was about to do something that would change the footwear industry forever. You see, in the years after taking full ownership, the Swartz family kept running into the same maddening problem, one that plagued nearly every boot manufacturer of the era. Leather boots, no matter how well made, no matter how carefully stitched, eventually let water in. Stitched seams, no matter how tight, created tiny channels where moisture could creep through. For loggers, for construction workers, for anyone spending a workday outdoors in the rain or snow of the American Northeast, wet feet weren't just uncomfortable. They were dangerous. Frostbite, trench foot, workdays cut short by numb, soaked feet. The Swartz family became obsessed, and I mean genuinely obsessed, with solving this. Sidney and Herman began experimenting with a completely different approach to boot construction. Instead of stitching the sole to the upper, why not use injection molding to literally fuse the two together, eliminating the stitch holes altogether? It sounds simple when you say it fast. It was anything but. This required convincing a major rubber manufacturer, Goodyear, to help develop a synthetic sole tough enough to survive brutal outdoor conditions while bonding seamlessly to genuine leather. And then came the testing. This is one of my favorite parts of the whole story because it's so wonderfully unglamorous. The Swartz brothers didn't have some high-tech laboratory. They tested water resistance by weighing boots down with metal and submerging them in buckets of water. They filled boots with dyed water and waited to see where the color would leak through. Simple, relentless. Exactly the kind of hands-on, trial-and-error craftsmanship Nathan Swartz had spent 34 years mastering as a young stitcher, now scaled up into an industrial innovation. And they weren't the only company chasing this problem. Established outdoor footwear names like Red Wing and LL Bean had decades of reputation and far deeper pockets. If the Swartz family's injection molding gamble failed, there would be no dramatic bankruptcy headline, no cautionary business school case study. There would just be quiet failure, a small family boot company, already stretched thin from the 1955 buyout, absorbing years of expensive research into a technique that never worked, competing against companies who didn't need to take that risk at all. But Nathan Swartz hadn't spent 34 years learning to fear risk. He'd spent 34 years learning that the only real failure was making something that let its owner down. By 1965, the injection molding technique was in production, and by 1973, the family had perfected it into something extraordinary, a genuinely waterproof leather boot built with a wheat-colored nubuck upper and a thick bonded rubber sole, guaranteed to keep feet dry no matter how brutal the New England weather got outside. Would this actually work the way they hoped? Would workers actually trust a boot this different from anything else on the market? They were about to find out. They gave this new boot its own name, separate from the Abington Shoe Company label. They called it Timberland. And it would go on to change absolutely everything. Because here's what happened next, and honestly, it's the kind of thing you couldn't script if you tried. The Timberland boot was designed, first and foremost, for blue-collar workers, loggers, contractors, tradesmen who needed a boot that could survive a New England winter without letting a drop of water through. It was sold in Army-Navy surplus stores, marketed with a bold, almost defiant guarantee of water resistance that no competitor dared to make. And it worked exactly as intended. Word spread through job sites and work crews across the Northeast. Finally, a boot that didn't leak. But something the Swartz family never planned for started happening almost immediately. College students began showing up in Timberland boots, not because they were logging trees, because the boots looked rugged, authentic, and effortlessly cool in a way that nothing else on the market did. A boot engineered purely for function was accidentally becoming a fashion statement, and Nathan Swartz's family was about to learn a lesson that would define the entire trajectory of the company. Sometimes your product finds an audience you never designed it for, and the smartest thing you can do is pay attention. By 1978, Timberland boots had become so successful that they made up 80% of everything Abington Shoe Company sold. Think about that. The little side project, the injection-molded, waterproof niche boot, named after nothing more exotic than a tree line, had completely swallowed the original business. So that year, the family made an obvious but still enormous decision. They retired the Abington Shoe Company name entirely. From that point forward, the company would simply be called what its customers already called it: Timberland. Nathan Swartz himself stepped back from daily operations around 1968, handing the reins to his sons, Herman taking over first, followed later by Sidney. He'd done the hardest part. He'd taken 34 years of stitching leather in someone else's shop and turned it into a company with his family's fingerprints all over its DNA. A company built on the exact values he'd learned as a teenage apprentice. That quality wasn't negotiable, that craftsmanship mattered even when nobody was watching, and that the person wearing the shoes you made deserved your full effort, whether they knew your name or not. But you didn't think the story stopped at successful regional bootmaker, did you? Because in 1980, something happened that nobody, and I mean nobody, at Timberland could have predicted. The company expanded into Italy. Now, stop and think about that for a second. Italy, a country famous for its own leather craftsmanship, its own fashion houses, its own deeply ingrained sense of style. Why would Italians want a rugged American work boot designed to survive a Maine winter? And yet, in Milan, a youth subculture called the Paninari, stylish, optimistic, obsessed with authentic American brands, adopted the Timberland boot as a core piece of their look, pairing it with Moncler jackets and Ray-Ban sunglasses in search of that unmistakable made in USA aesthetic. Executives at an Italian fashion distributor tested the boots in high-end boutiques in Milan and Rome, right alongside brands like Louis Vuitton and Ralph Lauren. And they sold. They sold fast. By 1983, Timberland's production had climbed to 1.8 million pairs a year, with European prices nearly double what Americans were paying. A work boot built for loggers in the American Northeast was now a luxury fashion item on the streets of Milan. However, riding a fashion wave is a dangerous game. Trends fade as quickly as they rise. If Timberland had stayed a one-note fashion fad in Italy, this could have been a short, forgettable chapter. Instead, the company kept investing in its core identity, durability, authenticity, and that same uncompromising quality Nathan Swartz had built the business on from day one. And in 1987, Timberland went public, a defining milestone that transformed a family business into a publicly traded American institution. But the story wasn't finished reinventing itself, not even close. In the early 1990s, something else remarkable happened. Something that had absolutely nothing to do with Timberland's marketing department, because Timberland's marketing department had nothing to do with it at all. In the streets of Brooklyn and across New York City, the Timberland boot, that same wheat-colored, waterproof, rugged work boot originally designed for loggers, was adopted by a rising generation of hip-hop artists. The notorious B.I.G. wore them constantly, weaving them directly into his music, rapping the line, "Tim's for my hooligans" in Brooklyn in his massive 1997 single, Hypnotize. Nas wore them. Wu-Tang Clan wore them. Boot Camp Click made the 6-inch Timberland boot practically a uniform. I want you to sit with how wild this is for a second. A boot engineered by the son and grandsons of a Ukrainian Jewish immigrant, built specifically to survive freezing New England job sites, had become one of the defining fashion symbols of Black urban culture and hip-hop in America, completely organically, with zero deliberate marketing push from the company itself. Timberland didn't chase this moment. This moment found Timberland because the product was genuinely, uncompromisingly good. And authenticity has a way of traveling on its own. As one industry analysis would later put it, while Timberland had influenced hip-hop's fashion aesthetic, it was really hip-hop, and Black culture more broadly, that transformed Timberland into the global icon it became. Now, you'd think a company riding two massive, unrelated cultural waves, European high fashion and American hip-hop, would have nothing left to worry about. But growth brings its own kind of crisis, and Timberland was about to face one of the toughest decisions in its history. Success, it turns out, has a way of exposing cracks that poverty never had time to reveal. When you're a struggling apprentice with 34 years of patience ahead of you, there's no room for internal conflict. Survival keeps everyone rowing in the same direction. But when a company suddenly finds itself worth real money, with real fame, and real strategic choices to make about where it goes next, family harmony can start to fracture. That's exactly what happened inside the company Nathan Swartz built. By the mid-1980s, Herman and Sidney Swartz, Nathan's sons, had been running the company together for years. But brothers don't always agree on direction, and in June of 1986, Sidney made the enormous decision to buy out his brother Herman entirely, taking on a $34.2 million loan to do it. Think about the stakes here. This wasn't some safe, incremental decision. Sidney was betting his own name, his own finances, and the future of his father's legacy on his singular vision for where the company needed to go next. And he didn't ease into it gently. In his very first year as sole leader, Sidney fired nearly a dozen executives, including the company's own CFO and national sales manager. This was a company at a crossroads, forced to choose an identity. Would Timberland chase the low end of the market, selling cheaper boots to a broader blue-collar customer base? Or would it lean into quality, into craftsmanship, into the same principle Nathan Swartz had lived by since he was 16 years old, stitching leather in a New York workshop? Sidney chose quality. The company launched an ad campaign built around a single, defiant slogan: more quality than you may ever need. It became more than an advertising line. It became the company's guiding philosophy, a direct echo of the values a poor immigrant stitcher had carried with him for over 3 decades before he ever owned a single share of the business. Rather than compete on price, Timberland would compete on durability, on making products so well built that quality itself became the brand's whole identity. Would the market actually reward that kind of stubbornness? For a while, nobody could be sure. Wall Street in the late 1980s was obsessed with cutting costs, chasing margins, squeezing every possible dollar out of manufacturing. A company publicly declaring it would rather build something too good than something merely profitable enough sounded, to a lot of outside observers, like a company about to get outcompeted. Sidney Swartz didn't blink. He'd grown up watching his father turn 34 years of stitching into an ownership stake, and he understood, maybe better than any outside analyst could, that his family's entire existence in this industry had been built on refusing to cut the corner that was easiest to cut. This bet paid off in staggering fashion. Between 1991 and 2000, Timberland's profits exploded from $80 million to more than $500 million. By the year 2000, the company had crossed a milestone Nathan Swartz surely never imagined back in that cramped New York shoe shop in 1918. Annual sales surpassed $1 billion, hitting $1.09 billion, with net income leaping 68% in a single year to over $126 million. A company built on a $20,000 bet by a 50-year-old former apprentice had become a billion-dollar global brand. I want you to notice something else here too. This wasn't a story about a single brilliant invention or a single lucky break. It was 3 generations of the same family, each one building on the discipline of the one before. A stitcher who became an owner, sons who turned a work boot into a global brand, and a grandson who turned that brand into something people believed in. Every single one of those chapters depended on the one before it holding up under pressure. If Nathan Swartz had cut a corner as an apprentice, there would have been no capital to buy into Abington in 1952. If he'd cut a corner as an owner, there would have been no reputation for his sons to risk everything on injection molding. Quality, it turns out, isn't just a slogan you put on an ad campaign. It's a chain, and every generation has to hold their link. And this is remarkable when you actually sit with where this story started. A 16-year-old immigrant boy stitching leather for someone else's shop with no money, no connections, and a family history shaped by poverty and persecution. That same lineage would go on to build one of the most recognizable footwear brands on the planet. Nathan Swartz had proven something that the entire arc of his early life seemed designed to disprove, that where you start doesn't have to determine where you end up, and that patient, stubborn craftsmanship, repeated for 34 unglamorous years, if that's what it takes, can eventually become an empire. Nathan Swartz passed away in August of 1984, having lived just long enough to see his sons carry his boot company toward the extraordinary heights it was about to reach. He never got to see the billion-dollar sales year. He never got to see the notorious B.I.G. immortalize his boots in a chart-topping single. He never got to see teenagers in Milan pairing his rugged work boot with designer jackets. But he built the foundation for every bit of it, with a lifetime of believing that quality was the one thing nobody could take away from him. The same way nobody could take away the trade his family had carried across an ocean and half a continent. His grandson, Jeff Swartz, would go on to lead the company into an entirely new era, taking over operational leadership in the mid-1980s when annual revenues were still under $100 million. Under his direction, Timberland would grow to nearly $1.5 billion in annual revenue by the time he eventually sold the company. But Jeff didn't just chase growth. He he built on his grandfather's original values in a new direction, launching the company's Path of Service program in 1992, giving every Timberland employee 40 paid hours a year to serve their communities, and eventually offering employees up to 6 months of paid service sabbaticals. In 2001, Timberland became the first company in its industry to publish a corporate social responsibility report. It pledged to plant 5 million trees. A company literally named after the woods and wildness of the American landscape started taking that name seriously as an environmental responsibility, not just a marketing image. Jeff liked to describe his family's company as having moved through 3 distinct chapters over the decades: boots, brand, and belief. First, his grandfather Nathan built the boots literally, with his own hands, 1 stitch at a time. Then his father and uncle built the brand, turning a work boot into a global name recognized on job sites, in fashion capitals, and in song lyrics. And finally, Jeff tried to build the belief, the idea that a shoe company owed something back to the world it operated in. In 2007, under his leadership, Timberland became the first company in its industry to attach something like a nutrition label to its shoe boxes, spelling out in plain language the environmental cost of every purchase. It was an odd, almost radical idea for a bootmaker to embrace. But it was also, in its own way, a very Nathan Swartz kind of idea. The belief that the person on the other end of the purchase deserved honesty, deserved respect, deserved a company that took its obligations seriously. It's not about what you do, Jeff would later explain of his philosophy. It's about who you are. Under his leadership, the company reduced emissions across its owned and operated facilities by nearly 40%, built a solar-powered distribution center in California, and put up a wind-powered factory in the Dominican Republic. In September of 2011, Jeff Swartz sold Timberland to VF Corporation, the same parent company behind the North Face and Vans, for $2.3 billion. $2.3 billion for a company that began as a 50% stake purchased by a former shoe stitcher in 1952 and became a full acquisition for just $20,000 in 1955. I think about that number every time I hear this story. $20,000 to $2.3 billion across less than 60 years. That's not just a business success story. That's the story of what happens when generational patience meets a genuine obsession with doing something well. Today, Timberland boots are worn by hikers on mountain trails, by construction crews on job sites, by fashion-forward teenagers who've never once thought about waterproof injection molding, and by hip-hop artists and their fans who turned a workwear boot into a cultural symbol decades ago and never let go. The brand Nathan Swartz's family built has outlived him by more than 4 decades, and it shows no sign of fading. But I don't think Timberland's real legacy is the $2.3 billion sale, or the billion-dollar sales years, or even the boots themselves, as iconic as they've become. I think the real legacy is a lot simpler than that. It's the story of a 16-year-old immigrant with nothing but a needle, thread, and a family trade nobody could take from him, who spent 34 patient, unglamorous years proving that he deserved more than the world was willing to hand him. Nathan Swartz never got a shortcut. He never got a lucky break. What he got was decades of quiet, disciplined craftsmanship that eventually bought him a seat at his own table. And that, I think, is the real story behind that little tree logo stitched into millions of boots around the world. Not luck, not privilege, just a poor Russian Jewish boy who refused to believe that stitching other people's shoes was the only thing he'd ever be allowed to do, and who proved, over 3.5 decades of patient work, that he was right.